get one made.
And we're live. Welcome to June, folks. Gosh, where's 6 months of the year gone? Wowzers. Hey, here we are, another Men as Allies, or Men's Voices, or whatever you wish to call it. But last night, might have been last night as well, but last month we explored who holds the line. But tonight we're kind of going a step further and exploring something slightly different, although obviously clearly related. What happens in those moments that don't happen in isolation, and what happens when they repeat? Because ultimately that's where culture gets created, because it rarely arrives all at once. It's just those small moments. It's built slowly, quite often invisibly, and then suddenly you realize it's become part of the norm. You know, a bit like, the phrase that I used in the posts, oh, that's just how they are. How many times have we heard that phrase happen? I mean, I probably even said it myself. But I'm sure we probably all have said it. But I think that sentence in and of itself, said a lot about how quickly we can become used to things and create them as the norm, and thus establish culture. So I guess I'm going to throw it to you guys. Lovely to see you all, as ever. You must have heard this phrase, or is it just me who's heard this phrase? Mark, I'll throw it to you first. Or is it just something that I've only heard?
That's a good question. Like, I suppose in the kind of work that we do, from a coaching perspective, you'll often hear someone say as to why they did something. It's because, well, that's the way we've always done it. And you always know when someone says, because that's the way we've always done it, you're in trouble. I will refer you to the Tying the Cat Down story from about a year ago. And I heard someone tell a very similar story at a thing I was at there last week. It was on the same lines of doing something because we've always done it, as opposed to knowing why we do it. And I think that's a very true statement of our culture. And I think probably, this is going far out there, right? But I think one of the reasons why we are at such loggerheads in our culture today, like you even look at, someone puts up a pride flag and you get the people giving out about it and stuff, because the culture is stretched to that. And there's a lot of people trying to keep it the way we've always had it, and they want it that way. And they're working hard to get it. Look at, what does MAGA mean except America 1950? That when America was great, that kind of thing. And there's people who are trying to push and really push in this direction. And we're struggling to find the middle ground, really, because we're at such polar opposites of where we want to be. We don't know what that is. And I think it's very easy to go back to it because it's an excuse too, isn't it? It's the way we've always done it. It's the way it always is. So it's easy because you can hide behind it, because you don't have to take responsibility if it's like that. And that's a nice thing to be able to do in a bad way, not have to take responsibility because it's what always happens. And, we spoke about it, Dan, you've mentioned the locker room kind of way in WhatsApp groups, because it's what happens in this space. So therefore it's fine because it's what happens, so it's not my problem. It's not my responsibility, but that's why it won't change, because too many of us are, it's not my problem.
And I think, we said last time, with regards to, who holds the line, we pretty much agreed that everybody holds a responsibility to hold the line. And therefore, we all have a responsibility to step in and say, no, that's not okay. Otherwise, as you say, it just carries on and we're unchallenged. And yet it needs to be challenged. I guess, Matt, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think it is too easy for it to become just normalised. And where do we stop?
Well, that's what it is, isn't it, really? That response of that's how it's always been, or other such like. Another one that I certainly do hear is, oh, he didn't mean it like that. He's not that kind of guy. He didn't mean it like that. And I think that's just a sort of a proxy for, I don't want the discomfort of challenging it, frankly. I get it. Most people don't like the confrontation, and particularly if it's somebody that you know and quite like, and you know who's generally a good guy, we let it slide because it's easier to do that. But you know, it's those little moments and not picking up those little moments that does create that culture.
Yeah, and I'm sure, you know, Dan, I'm sure you'll have some thoughts. I think, you know, certainly from, you know, a woman's perspective, you know, we almost, dare I say it, slightly got used to that. Do we like it? No.
Yeah.
Have we got used to that?
So one of my least favourite phrases from my previous life in working in a broadcast career, and the engineers used to use it all the time, was workaround. I'm like, no, guys, we don't work around. We fix stuff. We don't work around. And that phrase you said, Laura, it's a workaround, isn't it? Oh, I didn't like that, but he's just like that. It doesn't mean any harm. It's a workaround. I don't have to deal with it. I'm gonna dodge around it. And you know, culture is what's created in those moments, what we are and aren't prepared to accept, and especially collectively. And if we're afraid of change and clinging to some imagined version of the past, we're missing what it is to be human, what it is to be here on this earth now, which is to grow and evolve and change. That's the game, right? One of the only thing probably we can guarantee in life is change. Everything changes always. Nothing stays the same. So it's a fool's errand to be clinging to something that's gone. And we have to collectively decide that we're not going to have this anymore. We're not going to let these things slide. We're not going to let them go. We don't have to fall out with people. We don't have to be rude and confrontational with people, but we can just say quietly and calmly, nah, that's not going to fly. I'm afraid that's not acceptable. Most people, when you do that, they will climb down. They'll go, oh God, sorry. Oh no, what have I said there? They're not going to turn it into a confrontation, because a lot of people are saying that because it's habitual, because it's old jokes that have often got a laugh in the past. There's all sorts of reasons why we do it. Most of us don't have bad intentions, and that's why we all need each other to reflect it back to each other. I have said and done some really stupid things in my life, and actually I wish someone had said to me sometimes, because as you can tell, I don't mind talking, and sometimes with a drink inside me and the mouth going, I wished someone had gone, Dan, mate, no, that doesn't fly.
And it's interesting you say that, because, you know, the thing that was going through my head as you saying that, you know, is that actually I think women as well can, you know, equally say things that exactly that, you know, that we shouldn't have said it, not because we were necessarily setting out to harm somebody or be vicious, just because our lens of the world is one way and somebody else is a different way. And isn't that just human nature? I don't, you know, and I wonder whether just sometimes it is just saying, no, actually, this is a different perspective. This is how I am receiving it, what you're saying, and that doesn't sit well with me. I mean, have I massively oversimplified it? Well, I was laughing. I'm assuming that I have massively oversimplified it.
No, I don't think so. In many ways, like, you know, it does come to a perspective thing. Because I was only thinking earlier, I was preparing something for a talk I have to do in the morning, and I was talking about perspectives. And one of the pieces I was talking about was how our own perspective is very narrowed, and it's narrowed into this. This is what we see here. You know, this is generally our perspective. You know, and you know, if someone gets involved in coaching, the job in the coaching is to expand it, is to bring it out like this. Suddenly, your perspective is shifting out, and it's becoming more and more. And I think, and I was talking to someone about the idea of, you know, from a management perspective, you know, you only have your one way of seeing things, but you have to incorporate the other perspectives in order to be able to see the bigger picture, in order to make decisions in that bigger picture. So it is narrowed down to a perspective. but the perspective is bought into by the culture that we exist within, and it's sold to us by that culture that we exist within. So we are given this is your culture, and we go, okay, that's my perspective on this. This is what I take, and I hold, okay, grand, that's fine. And without it being challenged, it doesn't change. We hold on to that, and we hold on to that tight, because again, it's easy. It's given to us. We don't need to challenge it. We don't need to question it, and away we go. You know, if I like, you look at Ireland as a country, right? I grew up in a very, very Catholic country, and you know, everything was through that lens. Everything was, up until sometime in the mid 90s, the bishops could still declare what time a nightclub had to close at. It was bananas, you know. But that's where we still were, and today it's gone the opposite way completely, you know. And maybe we don't have a perspective in some ways for it, like, you know, there's a bit of a moral ground that we're struggling to find. And again, like I said at the start, it's from here to here, you know. We need to try and close that gap, but it is that perspective thing. And you know, it's easy to just accept that perspective, because then I don't need to do any work on it. Then that's the way it's always been, and that's fine. So therefore I can continue down this road, because this road, it's laid out in front of us. There you go. This is a nice little handy perspective, you know. So you can just stick to that and then keep those blinkers on, and you're fine.
And I guess the thing is that actually at that point that you keep the blinkers on, you've lost your sense of curiosity. You have, you know, and effectively you could be, you know, I've got this image in my head of effectively you're bulldozing your way through. In effect, you kind of ignored the people around you, and you know, when that comes to, you know, women and young women, that can actually be potentially quite damaging if a man has just kind of lost all sense of perspective of the impact that they are creating. I mean, that's, to be fair, true of anybody, but I know, thoughts, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing that I've had to really learn and reflect upon by sort of engaging in this. Like, I guess my perspective previously probably would have been, I'm not causing any harm here. But actually, safety isn't the absence of obvious harm. It's whether people feel able to speak, to challenge, to say no, to walk away, or just, I don't know, you know, like be themselves without having to calculate the consequences, as we've heard that, you know, women have to do so much. Am I going to do this? Let's calculate the consequences, you know. So I think my perspective that I am now recognizing I need to change is that fact that the absence of obvious harm is not equal to safety, and sort of needing to challenge that perspective and broaden out a little bit, because that's, again, I think we've mentioned this before, you know, that perspective of, well, I'm not causing any harm, so I don't need to do anything about it, is a very understandable, I like to think so because I felt it, understandable position for most men to come from. I've got enough on my plate, I'm not causing any harm, therefore I don't need to worry about it.
And I think that's very true. And I think it's interesting that you say, you know, the calculations that women do in order to feel safe. And I'm going to throw it to you, Dan, because you'll probably say that men do many calculations as well in order to because it's become so prevalent. I have a perspective that men also do a lot of calculations as to, oh, should I say that? Oh, don't know. You know, and actually therefore retreat and don't say anything at all, which actually then silence in and of itself is a challenge. And that then creates a culture that isn't safe as well.
Yeah, that definitely happens, Laura. I think a lot of people don't say things because they're worried about making things worse or saying the wrong thing, or coming across as jumping in and coming to the rescue of a woman who doesn't want somebody to rescue her at that point in time. Because we've all done that as men. We've intervened when it wasn't welcome, and we've been put firmly in our place. And there definitely can be a reticence there, Laura. It's difficult. I had an opportunity recently. A LinkedIn contact, somebody I got chatting with, runs a women's community, and she came to me very excitedly and said, let's get our two communities together and sit down and see what we can share and learn about each other. I was like, wow, I love that as an opportunity. So I went to my community and I said to them, right, what should we do with this? Give me some ideas, a steer. What can we learn from each other's experiences? Tumbleweed, nothing.
Yeah.
Tried again, got a couple of responses. One guy went off on some rant about how men are represented on daytime TV, and one bloke sent me a thumbs up.
Great.
And I think
how do we move that forward?
Yeah, and that speaks to, Laura, what you're saying there, because actually this is a group of good men, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really careful about the guys I have in my group. They're good guys who, want to do their bit for the world to make it a better place. And I know every one of them would like to be able to be an ally and create a safe environment, but they just don't know how. They just don't know what that means. And you're right, absolutely right. They're very concerned about saying the wrong thing at the wrong time and upsetting or offending somebody. And I think it's, that's not good enough, really. It's not good enough. But we can find ways to communicate these things. Graham Coulson, who's been on this call, who does bystander training, he talks about calling people in. And that was the first time I ever heard that. And I think it's a wonderful phrase. And I think it's exactly the attitude we should have and the way we should do it. There are times where lines have been crossed to the point you have to call out. But ideally, you call in. You speak to somebody as a friend and you say, look, mate, what you said there, this is how some people will receive that. And I think sometimes when you hold that mirror up to blokes, they're like, oh, God. Really? And people have done it to me, Laura, and they said, Dan, you said that, and here's how it landed. Because as I keep saying, my mouth runs away with me sometimes. And I'm like, oh, no, really? Oh, and then I get that reflected back to me, and I change. And I think most men would do that. They actually want to learn, but there's got to be a desire for both, on both sides, right? From women and men, to understand each other. And stop dismissing other people's experiences because you don't experience it. That's absolutely key. If we keep doing that and we're not listening, then there's no proper dialogue and nothing changes.
And I think that's exactly the point for me. I think it's we mustn't dismiss people's experiences because it's their experiences. That's men, women, young men. Everybody experiences the world in a slightly different way, and the moment that we dismiss anybody's experience, and we're not really listening, and actually we're not working together. And I think it's easy when we're busy to almost effectively what they're saying is, I haven't got time for this, I've got to carry on, and in that moment that can have an impact. But I think this is where I go to this place that actually women do that as well. Women can dismiss other women's perspectives and then have an impact. And I think, to your point, Dan, I mean, I went up to London recently to watch listen to Amy Watson of Hassel speak with the Dad Project. And it was, I mean, the question that headed up the event was basically, why don't women still feel safe? I mean, it was just a conversation, and it really was just a conversation. And, it was just an exploration. And, some of the, after about 20, 25 minutes, people from the audience were starting to sort of say, well, look, don't you realise that, all the things that I have to do before I even get into a taxi? And then the men were saying all the things that they started to be apprehensive about because they didn't want to tread on toes, say the wrong thing. And so, effectively silent. But the conversation gradually got momentum with it. But it was just quite an open conversation. It wasn't, it wasn't from a point of view, men, why are you doing this all wrong? It was genuinely just a very easy conversation. It was I don't know, kind of fireside chat, but not really. But it was an easy conversation because it was open-ended. It was about how everybody was experiencing the world. And I think when we go with that type of open curiosity, acknowledging that we all see the world differently, and actually any one of us could inadvertently offend somebody else just because of the way that we have experienced the world. But I guess, I think there's a part of me that says that quite often some things can be really small, and then afterwards we look back and go, oh, that was a bit bigger than that. I shouldn't have done that. I don't know. Is it just me who's had one of those where you think, oh, it was only small, and then you walk away and then you go, oh no, I can see how that's increased. You're all laughing at me, so I'm assuming that there has been definitely an occasion.
You don't know how anyone receives anything, to be honest with you, Laura. Like, you don't know what people are carrying. You don't know how the most innocuous remark can be an absolute trigger for someone else. But I think what's very interesting that you're talking about there, when you're talking about women are practiced at trying to be safe and men are concerned that they're doing the wrong thing. If we look at that from its root, it's like, so women are practiced at being are trying to manage their vulnerability while we're trying to manage to be vulnerable, and because we don't know how to do it,
Oh, I like that. Can we just,
which just sounds totally ridiculous, isn't it?
Let that land. That's genius, Carolan.
But I think there's the truth of it too, because that's what we're struggling with, and it was like, it's because I was doing a talk on vulnerability for men the other day, and I gave this talk. First time I was asked to do it was 3 or 4 years ago, and they asked me to do it, and I had this talk written, and it was to be on the Tuesday, and I was looking at it going, what is wrong with this talk? There's just something completely wrong with it, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it, and then I realized it's a talk on vulnerability, and I'm not being vulnerable. How can I talk about vulnerability and not be vulnerable? How can I keep myself out of the talk? So they called me actually on the Monday and said, listen, something's come up, we need to postpone by a week. And I was like, thank God, brilliant, right? So that I could actually sit and go, right, I'm talking about vulnerability, where do I fit into this? But it's not just a perfect example of how my protection was so strong that I even wrote a talk on vulnerability and didn't include myself being vulnerable in it. That's how much we protect ourselves, and that's how hard it is to struggle to be vulnerable. Because even when you're talking there about men struggle to speak to women, we struggle to say the right thing. Because, Christ, we struggle to be vulnerable with our wives. We struggle to be vulnerable with our partners. So to be vulnerable with someone else, that's such a stretch for us because we're so well protected in our suit of armor, in our safety, in our sense of safety, that's just so unsafe. And that's probably a lot of it there that we struggle with.
And it's so, it's like, as you say, you're giving a talk on vulnerability and yet you're not vulnerable. And actually people can feel that.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the thing, that's the irony of it. So even if you've gone in with your talk about vulnerability, but not been vulnerable, and then done the same talk and been vulnerable, people would have felt the difference. And I think that is so important to recognise is, you've got to be congruent what you say versus the sort of the emotion, the feeling that you give off. They've got to be congruent with one another, because otherwise people don't feel safe around that. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And I think that in and of itself can make people feel uneasy. Some of the work, as you know, I'm doing some work with South Eastern Railway about passenger safety. And, I was reflecting back on the conversation, and I was thinking, this is brilliant. You want to make all the passengers feel really safe, and you're getting all these passengers on board to this forum. But actually, if the teams, who are effectively the frontline teams to Joe and Jane Public don't feel safe in themselves, then actually all the work that we're doing isn't going to make a difference, because lack of inner safety will, will just ripple out of them, and women, young women, men will not feel safe anyway. I mean, so I think it's really important that we recognise that the two go together in order to be able to create, a culture that really does feel safe. I mean, I know it's not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy, because we have our own internal narratives and our own internal monologues that go on. Like, I'm sitting here just reflecting on all of this and going, it was the point that you made, Mark, about, we're not necessarily able to be vulnerable with our wives and our partners. And I was thinking, yeah, damn right. That when I think about being vulnerable with my wife, I'm then like, but is she then going to think less of me because that's not the typical masculine role? I should be the strong one. Showing vulnerability isn't necessarily very attractive. I can't do that. She'll think less of me. Now, my wife's done nothing to provoke that thought. There's no factual evidence in that, but it's the narrative that I've created in my head. And so it is very difficult to be vulnerable in that sense. And I'm almost being vulnerable about being vulnerable, if you know what I mean.
Vulnerable cubed.
Yes. So yeah,
that's just how culture builds up, though, isn't it? It's
that is culture, isn't it? That's spot on. We all have that. That's been given to us. That rule's been handed to us, and it is. This is the terrain we're treading, isn't it? As men, is having to appear to be strong and in control and unflustered and stoic, but also be vulnerable. And it's like, well, how do the two marry up? And actually, what they really are is one and the same thing, two sides of the same coin. When you are grounded and centered in who you are, and you know yourself, and you've done all your soul searching, and you've done all your healing and inner work, you get to take the armor off. And when you take the armor off, strength and vulnerability are one and the same thing. When the armor's off and you're vulnerable and you're out there and you're an open book because you haven't got any wounds and nobody can trigger you, that's when you're a strong man, somebody who puts out the energy of safety, Laura, and people feel safe around men like that, and they're drawn to men like that, because sadly they're few and far between. But that's the work, Laura, right? The work is to turn our attention inward, to look in the mirror, to do the healing, to look at the dark depths of our soul that we've hidden away from and run away from for years, maybe decades. Face all that stuff. Use things like forgiveness. Use things like letting go. Face it all and let it go. Then, when you're in that nice, present, grounded, clear state, ask yourself, what sort of world do I want to create? What sort of world do I want to live in? Do we want to live in a world where our women and girls don't feel safe? No, we do not. Right. So what can I do with what I've got right now to change that?
And I think that's it. I think, what's going through my mind right now is that, all too often, I think we see something as an outcome. It is, we are going to have a culture that is like this, but actually culture is a process. It's little things over time that accumulate, whether that's ourselves recognizing in the moment how we're evolving and just not accepting the status quo. And I think you've alluded to it there in what you've said, Darren, the fact that, recognizing where we're at, what is the world that we want to live in, and how does that look like? That's not something you get, if I think of my own journey of the last 10 years, I kind of knew the world that I wanted to live in and how I wanted to live my life. But I'm still endeavoring to adapt bits of it now, but it's by having that awareness and that curiosity in order to explore those things rather than the retreating and silencing ourselves, because otherwise we're not going to make any progress. And, when, in that sense, then the status quo remains. But I guess, therein lies the thing is culture isn't built all at once. It's built like one conversation, one choice, and one moment in a time, and it just builds through that. But yeah, you know, what we silently, you know, ignore and just pretend it hasn't happened will very quickly become the norm and very quickly become culture if we are not being conscious about the decisions we make, the conversations we have, the things that we choose to ignore. So I am very conscious of time because I know Mr. Carolan has to rush off. And for once, I'm going to endeavour to make it to 7 o'clock and actually cover time on time. Anyway, as ever, thank you, folks. We will see you next month. Any last final foods for thought?
There is a space for manning up, Laura, but we have that phrase so confused. You know, manning up has always been, you know, tough it out, do it regardless, you know, which there's value in that too, right? But it's not at the expense of anything else. Where manning up is doing the right thing at the right moment when you can. Manning up is approaching that vulnerability and strength factor as one thing. That's where we can man up in the best way. And I'd love to see that be what manning up becomes. You know, it's not ignoring it. It's going through the hardship, but it's going through the hardship of developing what we need to do to become and change the culture to what it needs to be.
No, I absolutely agree, Mark. Any final thoughts from you, Dan, Matt?
I would just say we are all responsible for culture, every one of us.
Yeah, I agree. Matt, any final food for thought?
I'm just going to bring my coaching mindset to this. You know, you talk about how it's the little moments, and you know, we're not going to create a perfect culture overnight. It's not going to happen, probably never going to happen anyway. But it's about questioning, well, what's the right sort of small first step? What's the right the small first step that is going to improve things?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you, because it's taking a step. You know, to not take a step means we're never going to get there. So thank you as ever, and look forward to next month, 9th of July, although some of us will be celebrating big birthdays, so won't be joining us. Anyway, wonderful. Take care, everybody.
Enjoy your 30th, Dan.